All right. My name is Carl Rasmussen. I'm a professor of machine learning. And I'd really like to give you a talk today entitled Halting Climate Change Using Machine Learning and AI. Unfortunately, I don't know how to do it using machine learning and AI, so I'll just talk to you about how to halt climate change. Before we start, I'll just try and outline what I think are two very important properties of the climate system. So one of them is that the climate system, this response to the climate system is slow and delayed, right? So the reason for that is, first of all, that the temperature of the system is determined by the cumulative emission of carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide sort of stays in the atmosphere. Most of the carbon dioxide that has been released since the start of the Industrial Revolution is still up there, right? And secondly, the climate system also has inertia, so it takes a long time for the oceans to warm up and for the ice to melt, right? So this means that we can only really address climate change if we accept that the future generations or people who come after us, we value, their conditions as well as our own, right? If we don't subscribe to that, well, then there isn't a climate problem, right? Because then people after us will just have to fend for themselves, right? So I'm just going to assume that we value future generations for the rest of the talk. So I'm old, so that means when the shit really hits the fan, I'll be dead. But you are young, so you don't share that advantage with me, right? So I think you are at least as motivated to solve the problem as I am. Okay, so the second part of what the characteristic of the problem is that the climate system responds to our collective actions, right? That means that whenever a nation or a company or an individual, but let's talk about nations at the moment, when they decide whether they're going to use fossil fuels, for example, then the problem here is that what they see is they get all the benefit of using the fossil fuel, right? If they use it to power an engine or heat their house or something like that, they get all the benefit, but they don't get most of the cost, right? Because most of the cost will just disappear up in the atmosphere and disappear into the rest of the world, right? So that means that the individual incentive for a country isn't really measuring the right thing, right? So this has many names, like economist talks about unpriced externalities, right? It means you don't think about it, right? But of course, it's still there. That means that if you look at the global incentive, right, then if you think globally, then if everybody's doing that, then of course we are receiving all of the costs as well, right? And this is really the central problem in climate change, right? And if you don't believe that, then it might be useful to imagine that there were some big walls or some domes around each country, right, so that all the CO2 that you had emitted was only above your country, and you had to deal with that, right? Then it would be a totally different kind of problem, right? Some problems would be in very deep trouble at the moment, and some countries would be, not perturbed at all, right? But that's not the situation we're in. The situation we're in is that we're sharing this thing because there's only one atmosphere that mixes very quickly. Right? So I think that the only way that you can address this issue is by global cooperation. What does global cooperation mean? It's basically a mechanism to realign the small-scale incentives with the global incentives. Right? And if we can't do that, then we can't solve the problem. If we can't do that, then we can solve the problem. So the way I'm going to organize this talk is I'm going to first talk a little bit about what does cooperation really look like and what does it mean? Then I'll talk about what are we doing about it at the moment, right? I'll talk about the Paris Agreement, and I'll reveal to you that I'm very much against the Paris Agreement. I think it's a terrible agreement. I'll explain to you why I think it's a terrible agreement. And then, this is supposed to be a positive talk, then I'm going to tell you that we can actually fix those problems, and there are ways to deal with this problem in a much better way, right? And I'll be very, very specific. I have a very specific proposal of how we can go about doing that. So first of all, why should you cooperate, right? So we need to set up a system where there's international cooperation between free sovereign countries. What that means is that you can't force anybody to do anything, right? We'll have to have a system where it's going to be in everybody's interest to join into this thing, right? So the question presents itself, why would people want to collaborate in this way, right? Now, if you have successful cooperation, then that means that everybody pays a small cost, right? We'll have to do things slightly differently from the way we're doing things at the moment, but we'll avoid a much larger cost that'll have to do with, what would happen if we leave climate change unchecked. And failure to cooperate, of course, means that everybody will take this very large cost, which can far exceed the benefit associated with getting a small benefit of using a fossil fuel for whatever purpose you want, right? Now, the difficulty here, the central difficulty is, of course, that you have to deal with avoiding free riding. So what does that mean? Well, that basically means that a free rider would be somebody who says, no, I don't want to participate because they're going to get the benefit of the rest of the world trying to solve the problem anyway, right? Because we all share the atmosphere. So that is the thing that we need to avoid. Now, you often hear in the media sentences like, my country is only responsible for 1% of the emissions, so it's essentially irrelevant what we do, right? A surprising number of people say this, and of course, this is the wrong inference. This is completely not understanding what cooperation means, right? So that's a very dangerous that's a very dangerous thing. Okay, so when does cooperation work? There's actually a really good book about this, written by Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize in economics for this work, Governing the Commons. And she's gone out there and looked at communities where they actually share common resources and figured out, how do they go about arranging themselves, right? It's a great book that I really recommend, and I've not tried to list all her conclusions here, but the main ones, right? So what are the necessary conditions for cooperating, right? One of them is that the participants share objectives, right? So we're lucky in that case because almost all countries will be hit by climate change, not all in the same way, not all to the same degree. Okay, fair enough, but almost all countries have an interest in avoiding this. Secondly, and this is a very, very important point, is that you need to have mutual trust, right? You need to trust the partners that you're cooperating with. If you don't trust them, then cooperation is never going to work, right? Thirdly, you need to show commitment. You need to be able to show that you're really committed to the cause and you're willing to make the investment, which is necessary. And also there has to be transparency. All the partners have to be able to see what are the other parties doing. Okay, so those are the main factors here. The one I'm going to focus on is on mutual trust. Okay, but we've already got the Paris Agreement, right? Why aren't we already cooperating? And I want to argue here that no, actually the Paris Agreement has a lot of really bad properties that go totally against the things that are necessary to support cooperation. Okay, so I think the Paris Agreement is going to fail, and what I mean exactly by that is that we won't manage the 1.5 degrees, for example, which is one of the main objectives of it. So here are a number of the reasons. I'll only talk about a few of them. I have more objections to the Paris Agreement if you want to talk to me later. So first of all, there's a collective goal, but there's no duties or responsibilities. So anybody who's ever organized anything knows that you have to have responsibility, right? You cannot just say, well, we just agree that something needs to happen, and then we hope, right? That's not going to work, right? Everybody knows that that's not going to work. So secondly, there are no binding commitments from the parties, right? So it's a little complicated in the detail. Like, so countries have committed to the Paris Agreement, but they don't commit to the promises they make about their emissions because they are in the annexes and they're not committing to the annexes, right? So there are no commitment. You can change your commitment at any time. You can go back on your commitment. There are these. So essentially, there are no commitments in the framework, or at least they're not binding, right? Thirdly, and this is very, very important, there's no framework for building mutual trust, right? The problem is that we make commitments, the NDCs, these are called natural determined contributions, they are made for far into the future, typically 2030 or net zero by 2050, so this is far into the future, and there's no way to check that your partner is actually serious about the commitments they've made, right? Which are not legally binding. But even if they did make the commitment, right? And that is exactly something which is being discussed at the COP at the moment. You know, is Britain serious about their 2030 commitment? Our Prime Minister says yes, but lots of other people say no, right? So, and how does that build trust in the system? It builds mistrust in the system. Like, all the parties are mistrusting each other because they don't believe that they're actually going to adhere to their commitments. Okay, so I've already talked about the NDCs and the net zero. Then there are poor intermediate objectives. So this may be something where I could say something a little bit at the flavor of machine learning. If you try to optimize a system, if you've ever tried to write down a new learning algorithm by minimizing a cost function, then what often happens is it manages to minimize the cost function without actually solving the problem, right? Because the cost function didn't have the right terms in it, right? And I think there's a lot of that going on with the objectives. So, for example, being net zero by 2050 doesn't really correspond to the thing that we're interested in, which is the cumulative emission of CO2, right? Why is it okay to emit anything you like in 2049, but it's forbidden in 2050? Like, that's a bit bizarre, right? But okay, that's the way it's written down at the moment, right? So if you analyze the way the objectives are set, they're not really aligned to the thing that we're interested in. There's a singular focus on the temperature as a proxy, and I think this is a very bad thing for several reasons. One of them is that temperature is very difficult to measure. It fluctuates, like it's stochastic from year to year. It's difficult to measure because it requires integration over the entire world. Also, it's difficult we commit to the temperature being 1.5, at most 1.5 degrees, but it's difficult to associate that with the behavior, right? If we are committed to a maximum level of CO2 at being 450 ppm, which corresponds to roughly the same thing, then you could say, okay, there's this much CO2 that we can still emit. What are you doing about it, and what are you doing about it, right? But the 1.5 degrees, you can't really connect that to behavior, right? And that's the only way that the goal is stipulated. Okay, the UN governs by consensus. That means that a single country can say, nah, we don't like the sound of this, right? And at the moment, I've heard that they are debating whether the new treaty should say lowering carbon or, I forget the exact terminology, phasing out or phasing down. Okay, great debate to be having, right? We're actually in a crisis situation. Okay, it also lacks property, which I call the I will if you will property. There's a great paper by, which I've mentioned down here, which also talks about the nature of cooperation. Okay, I'll show a little bit of data. Here's the data set that shows how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, measured on the Mauna Loa volcano over the last 64 years. So in do I have a pointer somewhere? Yeah, so this graph is showing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and you can see that it's growing. It also has a little seasonal variation. The concentration varies over the year because the plants on the landmass take up CO2 in the summer, and they release it again in the winter. And down here, I've shown you on the other axis here, I've shown you the derivative of the amount of CO2 when I've deseasonalized it. And the derivative is a very wobbly function, so I've averaged it either on an annual, using annual averaging, or 3-year averaging, or 10-year averaging. And you can see that the growth rate is, since the Paris Agreement started in 2015, has been constant at about 2.5 parts per million per year, right? So, and of course, this thing has to be, this graph has to go to 0, right, before we can stabilize the temperature. Here's another little bit of data. So here I plotted, as a function of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, I plotted the temperature for each year, right? And you can see that this is very close to a straight line, right? There's no fundamental reason why you would think this would be exactly a straight line. There are lots of effects that are changing over time, and with there are aerosols in the atmosphere, and there are time delays in the process. But all of these things seem to more or less average out. So there's a pretty good linear fit, right? I can't decide any way in which this looks non-linear, right? And the fit is pretty good, so it's the standard deviation is less than 0.1 degrees, and again for the same data over 64 years. And the slope of this line means that 10 ppm growth corresponds to 0.1 degree, right? And since the atmosphere, the concentration is growing by 2.5 ppm per year, that means that the temperature is growing by 0.1 degree every 4 years, which means that the last 0.3 degrees that we've got to the 1.5 degrees of Paris will happen in 12 years, so in 2035. Right? And I don't think there's anything, so there are no real assumptions here. I'm just looking at what actually happens, right? So I think 2035 is when that hurdle will fall. Okay, so that's the system that's not working. So how do we think about things in a better way? So first of all, I think it's important to think about the residual amount of CO2 that we haven't released yet. So if we're going to solve the problem, then the CO2 will saturate at some point. So we don't know what that point is, but the concentration we have at the moment, the difference between the concentration we have at the moment and the one that we'll finally get to, we can think of that distance as being a resource, right? It's a resource that we have that we still haven't used, right? This is a funny resource because the resource is the absence of something, right? Normally resources are the presence of something, right? But it does obey the characteristics that resources obey, right? So one of them is that it's a desirable thing and it exists in limited quantity, right? So those are both true. So now there's a question about, who owns this resource, right? And I don't mean this in a legal sense, but in an ethical sense, like who does it really belong to? And I think it's very hard to argue for any other answer than it belongs to all of us, right? So let's go with that. Let's think about the fact that this resource might belong to all people of Earth. How is this resource being managed? Well, it's not being managed, right? You can just use it. Anybody can use it any way they want, right? So maybe that's not a good idea. And thirdly, we act as though the price of this resource was set to 0, right? If it was a resource that we all own, so that you might be able to take that position, but in that case, we have determined that the price should be set to 0, right? So my key idea here is to come up with a suggestion. Maybe we should set the price to something positive instead. Okay, this is a way of turning this unpriced externality into, bringing it back into the into the equation. But how would we actually do that in practice? Okay, so here's the proposal. The proposal for a climate club. So a climate club is basically an alliance of nations where every nation can decide to be a member or not a member as they see fit, right? And the club that I'm proposing works on a yearly cycle, right? So it only exists on a yearly cycle. So every year you have to decide whether your nation wants to be a member of the club or not. Okay, so how does it work? So on the yearly cycle, first of all, every country has to decide to join the club or not. And the club has this thing, which is there's a price which is associated with emitting a ton of CO2, and the price here is called P, right? And the price P is something which is set before we start. In the first year, I'll have to preset it, but I'll explain to you how the price gets set in the future. So anyway, there's a price P, and every country has to decide, are we going to join the club at that price P? Okay, and then at the end of the year, each country has to report how many emissions have they had of greenhouse gas emissions, and then we can use the UNFCCC reporting system. That's a system that has been developed under the Paris Agreement, so that's actually a good thing that we can borrow and we can lean on. So people have to report. Every country has to report how much CO2 do they emit, and then you have to pay your contribution, which is the emission times the price. Okay. Now, what the club does, it immediately redistributes all the funds according to the population of the member countries. Okay, and this reflects the fact that the resource was owned by all the members of the club, right? Okay, so you get paid back according to how many people in your nation. And the very last thing you do is that the member countries then vote on what should the price be next year, right? And I propose that this should be done by an open ballot median vote, 1 vote per country. And that's it. That's the whole proposal. That you have to start this off in some way. So maybe you could start off the price of 100 euros per ton. This is roughly in line with what the European ETS trading system. I think the price at the moment is 88 euros per ton, so something of that order. The British system is only half that price, interestingly. Okay, so that is the entire proposal. Yeah, we have a question.
So why would countries join first and second?
Okay, we need to get there. Yeah, hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. First of all, let's try to understand what the properties would be of a club like this, right? So first of all, this club is designed to coexist with other schemes, right? We can continue having the Paris Agreement, we can continue to have the European Trading Scheme, and we can continue to have countries pledge whatever they want on the side of this thing, right? So we're not trying to take over anything, we're trying to do something in parallel. So first thing to notice is that every nation's net contribution or payout will only depend on their per capita emissions, right? It doesn't depend on the size of the country or the absolute size of the emissions. It's only the emissions per capita, which seems like the reasonable way to measure, you know, how much damage does emitting the CO2 make. Thirdly, membership of the country, of course, immediately applies a strong economic pressure to all members to reduce the CO2. Like, not just big polluters, like even if you're a small polluter, then you would be receiving more money from the club than you would be putting in, right? But if you could lower your CO2 emissions even more, then of course you would be getting an even bigger benefit from being part of the club, right? So it should be clear that if your emissions is average of all the club members, then the amount you pay in and the amount you get out is going to be the same, right? And if you have a bigger emission per capita than the average, then you'll be a net contributor, and if you have a smaller contribution, you'll be a net beneficiary. Like, so UK, for example, if all countries were members, UK have an emission of 5 tons per year at the moment, which is equal to the global average. So UK would be a neutral member in that sense, if all members all countries were members. Okay, now because of this annual cycle, the club builds trust, right? You can trust your partners because you can see that they did what they promised last year, right, and the year before that, right? And if they are not going to pay up, then you will also know it immediately or within a year, right? So because the turnaround is really quick, of course you can't change the amount of CO2 that you put out, because you would have to change your whole infrastructure and the way you run your country, and you can't do that in a single year, right? But you can signal your intention of doing that by saying, well, I'm going to pay the fee until I get my act together, right? And that's a strong pressure on you to do that. Yes?
What happens if someone doesn't live up to what they promised? Right?
Okay, so if you say you're going to be a member, you want to be a member, and then you don't pay up, then it's equivalent to not being a member, right? And then that would be on the record that you effectively you weren't a member that year, right?
Correct.
So your membership only really gets verified by the time you pay in, but before that, nothing material happens anyway.
So the outcome of it is that I'm not going to receive any money, but I will keep emit.
Okay, so you've emitted, so you'll be treated equivalently as being a non-member. Yeah, you'll effectively have withdrawn your membership, right?
I don't understand the pressure to reduce. I mean, if you're getting money from I could join a few years as a country, get money because I'm a net, I'm below the average, and then invest in coal, fossil fuels, and leave the club. Or everybody could even, if everybody emits more the next year, but it's a constant, then there's also no. I mean, why is
so if you're a low emitter, then this is going to be a really good arrangement for you, right? Because you're going to receive funds every single year, right?
Yeah, I mean,
why would you build coal plants in that case?
Why can't you use that money for everything? That's the question.
You can use the money in any way you like, and I think that's very important. I don't think any countries are going to sign up to a club where the club dictates what they can spend their money with. I think that's just not going to be feasible, right? I think we'll have to accept that people do whatever they want to do with the money, but we'll require that we know how much CO2 they produce, right? Because that's what's going to hurt the global community, right? And that's what matters. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm going to leave time. I know there are a couple of people who are wanting to ask questions. Let me just go a few more slides. Simplicity, right? So the club is a really simple thing. It's governed by a single number. I have tried to come up with schemes that don't have any numbers, but I can't actually do that, right? This one has one number, right? The price, and there's no room for negotiation. Like, no country can argue with what the rules are or anything like that. They can just accept membership or not, right? And this has been a problem in the UN before. So the Kyoto Protocol basically died because people couldn't agree on anything. There's nothing to agree to here. Either you're a member or not. You can't negotiate anything. And I think the schemes have to have that flavor. Thirdly, there's transparency, right? So everything is open. Everything is clear from the start. You know what the price is going to be, but you're saying yes to. You're not saying yes to something which is not out there in the open. Also, another thing which I think is important is that nations can join conditionally, right? You can say, Britain could say, well, we'll join, but only if Germany and France also join, right? And maybe they could say the same thing, and then we could resolve that. Okay, they all join, or they all don't join. Okay, there was another question up here, a short one.
Let's say Denmark, Norway, Sweden, maybe Germany join, and some countries which have very low emissions also join because they can make money off it. What's the incentive for, like, let's say US to join? So they are maybe at 60 times.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so club dynamics. So nations in the global south, which have very low emissions, they would have an immediate economic incentive to join, right? So how do we get the bigger polluters to join, right? Okay, so there are three different reasons I can see that you might want to join, right? So you might believe in the ethical principle that the atmosphere or that resource in the atmosphere belongs to everyone, right? Or you would have to at least declare every year that you believe that your own nation owns a bigger part of that resource, right? At the moment, countries can sort of say, yes, we're on, but then do nothing, right? You are not allowed to say to do that in this scheme. Every year you have to say, well, is your money where your words are, yes or no, right? And so you would have to say, no, we don't want to be a part of it because we think our citizens are worth more than other people's citizens, or whatever your reasoning might be, right? So that would have to be explicit. Okay, you might also join because you understand that a club like this would actually reduce the global emissions, and it would actually contribute to really solving the problem. That might be another good way of joining. And the transparent annual cycle, which I already alluded to, might put pressure on non-members, right? What would you feel like being in a country that says, no, we're not going to join? Like other countries like us are joining, but we're not joining, right? That would put, again, an immediate pressure on, say, the electorate or on the political system of saying, there is a scheme. At the moment, there isn't a scheme, but if there was a scheme, I think that would be a very strong pressure. But, of course, there are some countries who derive almost all their income from selling fossil fuels, and, of course, it would be very difficult to bring them on board. But this scheme doesn't require that all countries join. It requires that a large fraction of countries join. So you asked a question specifically about the US. I think the US is kind of in a weird place at the moment. It's very hard to make any statements about that. They might not want to join for the first little while until they kind of sort themselves out, right? I think we have to think of schemes where a lot of countries would join, right? There might be some outliers for various reasons that won't want to join right away. Okay, so be it. Of course, once a nation has joined, it'll be in that nation's interest to get other more polluting nations to join, right? So there'll be a pressure. Once you're in the club, you want the club to grow. It'll be in your interest to get the club to grow. I also think that probably if this club actually took off and a substantial number of countries were members, then presumably they would start putting pressure, other types of pressure on countries that weren't members, saying, for example, trade barriers, and say, well, we will put tariffs on importing goods from your countries if you are refusing to play by the rules of this club. So you could have other types of pressures as well. Last thing is that adjusting the price annually will enable the club to adapt to future demands, and I think this is a very important property, that at the end of the year, countries can now vote for what they think the price should be going forward, right? And of course, very low emitters it would be in their interest to push the price high, but not so high that they think that large emitters would defect, right? So there would be a balancing act that people would have to entertain. How far can we push this, and we revisit this every year, right? Okay, so a couple of things that this club doesn't solve. The club doesn't address widely differing historical emissions. Of course, some countries have emitted a lot historically, and they would be entering this new club on equal terms to other countries, right? So this scheme basically doesn't address that. It addresses the future resources from what we have today. And also, the proposal is very demand-side oriented, right? It sort of says, well, if you, let's say you drill for oil and you export it to other countries, well, then that would seem that you're sort of a bad player, but this scheme doesn't have anything to say about that, right? It only measures, whose tailpipe does the CO2 come up through, right? Okay. It doesn't solve all problems, but it does solve some substantial problems that we're currently not solving, right? So let's not make the perfect be the enemy of the good. Okay, so what have we got here? So, well, I think it's difficult to predict whether humanity is really up to solving this thing. But I think it's very important to realize that the schemes that we have in place at the moment are not fit for purpose, right? And pushing against a locked door is not really a good strategy, right? And one of the things that I wanted to try to show was that this is not an inherently intractable problem, right? There is actually schemes that you could think of, that you could set up. I have one particular proposal here. I've tried to make it very concrete. I'm not wed to any of the details of this, but I think proposing it in detail actually makes it easier to understand and think about. And I think you can solve a lot of the problems that we're not even thinking properly about currently. So I think the thing that I've proposed is, it's a very simple proposal, only involves one number. It's equitable. It says that everybody owns the same amount of the resource. It's completely transparent, and it can build trust, and it can take immediate effect. All things that are necessary if you want to come up with a scheme like this. So I think, in conclusion, we need to solve the problem. We need to really understand what is the problem about, and the problem is about global cooperation, right? And that's a good thing because we know how to cooperate, right? You can look it up in books that have been written about it, right? So now we just have to go out there and do it. Thanks for listening.